Elixir Guides, quote and unquote. This guide aims to introduce the metaprogramming techniques available in Elixir. The ability to represent an Elixir program by its own data structures is at the heart of metaprogramming. This chapter starts by exploring those structures and the associated quote and unquote constructs. So we can take a look at macros in the next chapter and finally build our own domain-specific language. Quoting. The building block of an Elixir program is a tuple with 3 elements. For example, the function call sum123 is represented internally as a tuple sum empty list 1, 2, 3. You can get the representation of any expression by using the quote macro. So quote do sum123. The first element is the function name. The second is a keyword list containing metadata, and the third is the arguments list. Operators are also represented as such tuples. So quote do 1 plus 2. So we get the plus, and then some context, Elixir, import kernel, then the arguments 1 and 2. Even a map is represented as a call to map. Variables are also represented using such triplets, except the last element is an atom instead of a list. Except the last element is an atom instead of a list. When quoting more complex expressions, we can see the code is represented in such tuples, which are often nested inside each other in a structure resembling a tree. Many languages would call such representations an abstract syntax tree, AST. Elixir calls them quoted expressions. Sometimes, when working with quoted expressions, it may be useful to get the textual code representation back. This can be done with the macro toString1 function. So we quote, and then we do the inverse of quoting, and we turn it back to the string. In general, the tuples above are structured according to the following format: atom, or tuple, list, atom. The first element is an atom or another tuple in the same representation. The second element is a keyword list containing metadata, like numbers and contexts. The third element is either a list of arguments for the function call or an atom. When this element is an atom, it means the tuple represents a variable. Besides the tuple defined above, there are 5 Elixir literals that, when quoted, return themselves and not a tuple. They are atoms, numbers, lists, strings, and tuples with 2 elements. Most Elixir code has a straightforward translation to its underlying quoted expression. We recommend you try out different code samples and see what the results are. For example, what does string.uppercase foo expand to? We have also learned that if true, do this, else that is the same as if true, do this, else that, end. How does this affirmation hold with quoted expressions? Unquoting. Quote is about retrieving the inner representation of some particular chunk of code. However, sometimes it may be necessary to inject some particular chunk of code inside the representation we want to retrieve. For example, imagine you have a variable number which contains the number you want to inject inside a quoted expression. Number 13, macro to string, quote, do 11 plus number. But we wanted 11 plus 13. So that's not what we wanted. Since the value of the number variable has not been injected and number has been quoted in the expression, in order to inject the value of the number variable, unquote has to be used inside the quoted representation. It's like quote interpolation. Unquote can even be used to inject function names. So unquote fun, just hello here, world. In some cases, it may be necessary to inject many values inside a list. For example, imagine you have a list containing 1, 2, 6, and want to inject 3, 4, 5 into it. Using unquote won't yield the desired result. So quote do 1, 2, unquote inner, then we get this nested list. That's when unquote splicing becomes handy. Unquote splicing inner. That's neat. Unquoting is very useful when working with macros. When writing macros, developers are able to receive code chunks and inject them inside other code chunks, which can be used to transform code or write code that generates code during compilation. Escaping. As we saw at the beginning of this chapter, only some values are valid quoted expressions in Elixir. For example, a map is not a valid quoted expression. Neither is a tuple with 4 elements. However, such values can be expressed as a quoted expression. In some cases, you may need to inject such values into quoted expressions. To do that, we need to first escape those values into quoted expressions with the help of macro.escape1. Macros receive quoted expressions and must return quoted expressions. However, sometimes during the execution of a macro, you may need to work with the values, and making a distinction between values and quoted expressions will be required. In other words, it is important to make a distinction between a regular Elixir value, like a list, a map, a process, a reference, etc., and a quoted expression. Some values, such as integers, atoms, and strings, have a quoted expression equal to the value itself. Other values, like maps, need to be explicitly converted. Finally, values like functions and references can be converted to a quoted expression. Values like functions and references cannot be converted to a quoted expression at all. You can read more about quote and unquote in the kernel.specialforms module. Documentation for macro escape and other functions related to quoted expressions can be found in the macro module. In this introduction, we have laid the groundwork to finally write our first macro. So let's move on to the next chapter. Kernel special forms. Special forms are the basic building blocks of Elixir and therefore cannot be overridden by the developer. We define them in this module. Some of these forms are lexical, like alias2, case2, etc. The macros curly brace 1 and double pointy bracket 1 are also special forms used to define tuple and binary data structures respectively. This module also documents macros that return information about Elixir's compilation environment, such as _env, _module, _dir, and _caller. Finally, It also documents two special forms, _block1 and _aliases1, which are not intended to be called directly by the developer, but they appear in quoted contents since they are essential in Elixir's constructs. That's all for now. I'll be back tomorrow. Cheers.